Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's longest-serving prime minister, started his day at the center of political power, leading a meeting of his new cabinet. Then, just hours later, this difficult journey, trading the halls of government for this courtroom where his corruption trial got underway. Netanyahu, a polarizing figure in Israel for decades, continues to stir passions.
I came here to support the Prime Minister, the best one on the war in Israel, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu.
Hopefully, the court is going to make justice and is going to send him to jail.
If convicted, Netanyahu could face years in prison. He's charged with fraud, bribery, and breach of trust, accused of receiving expensive gifts, including cigars and champagne, in exchange for favors, and for helping a media company so it would publish favorable news stories about him. Netanyahu has long called it nothing more than a witch hunt. Today, accusing the police and attorney general of trying to topple a strong right-wing prime minister.
And it's a very embarrassing situation for the country to be in.
This legal expert says having a sitting PM on trial is a clear conflict of interest.
This is going to seriously undermine trust in government because we will never know whether the prime minister has pushed for this or that option because this is what's good for the country, or maybe this is something that could help him in his criminal trial.
Netanyahu, though, is a political survivor. The opposition failed to unseat him in 3 separate elections in the past year. The question now is whether it will be this court that will put an end to Netanyahu's political career. Derek Stoffel, CBC News, Toronto.
Former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is currently facing a number of charges. During the 4th and 5th governments of Israel, Netanyahu had faced a number of corruption scandals that allegedly directed and involved Netanyahu and his close political allies in the Likud Party. They're all being currently investigated. The Israeli police began investigating Netanyahu starting in December of 2016. As a result of their investigation, police recommended indictments against him. And additionally, on November 21st, 2019, Netanyahu was officially indicted for breach of trust, accepting bribes and fraud. However, not much is known about Netanyahu's more nefarious crimes, or if they are, they're totally neglected by the world stage for fear of being labeled an anti-Semite. His number of lies regarding Arab states start way back, and while he was influenced in the American government. His first term as Israeli prime minister started in 1996, after a spate of suicide bombings reinforced the Likud position for security. Hamas had claimed responsibility for most of the bombings. As Prime Minister Netanyahu, he raised many questions about the central promises dedicated in the Oslo Accords. One of the main points was his disagreement with the Oslo premise is that the negotiations should proceed in stages, meaning that concessions should be made to Palestinians before any resolution was reached on major issues such as the status of Jerusalem and the amending of the Palestinian National Charter. The Oslo supporters had claimed that the multi-stage approach would build goodwill among the Palestinians and would propel them to seek reconciliation when these 2 major issues were raised in later stages. However, Netanyahu said that these concessions only gave encouragement to extremist elements without receiving any tangible gestures in return. He called for tangible gestures of Palestinian goodwill in return for Israeli concessions. Despite the stated differences with the Oslo Accords, Netanyahu continued his implementation, but his premiership saw a marked slowdown in the peace process. Many weren't willing to accept that the Likud Party, which is a nationalist entity, to be in the way of progress regarding the Palestinians, who were trying their very best to regain the peace process for the Middle East. Eventually, the lack of progress of the peace process led to new negotiations, which produced the Wye River Memorandum, which is basically an agreement negotiated between Israel and the Palestinian Authority at the summit in Maryland, between October 15th and 23rd, 1998, which involves the West Bank. In 1997, Netanyahu authorized the Mossad operation to assassinate Hamas leader Khaled Mashal in Jordan, just 3 years after the two countries had signed a peace treaty. The Mossad team, covering as 5 Canadian tourists, entered Jordan on September 27, 1997, and injected poison into Mashal's ears in a street in Amman. The plot was exposed and the agents were arrested by the Jordanian police. However, the damage was done. Netanyahu was defeated by Ehud Barak in 1999. Netanyahu's views on counterterrorism was pretty strict. He said on his own that he was against the hardline terrorists and that they came as a result because of his brother's death, Yoni Netanyahu, which he was killed in a hostage rescue mission on Operation Entebbe. In addition to have taken part in counter-terrorist operations himself during his service in the military, Benjamin Netanyahu has published 3 books on the subject of fighting terrorism. He identified terrorism as a form of totalitarianism, writing, quote, "The more far removed the target of the attack from any concession or connection to the grievance enunciated by the terrorists, the greater the terror. Yet for terrorism to have any impact, it is precisely the lack of connection, the lack of any possible involvement or complicity of the chosen victims in the cause the terrorists seek to attack that produces the desired fear," end quote. Netanyahu also cautioned that the trouble with active anti-terrorist activities is that they do not constitute a substantial intrusion on the lives of those being monitored. He believed that there is a balance between civil liberties and security, which should depend on the level of sustained terrorist attacks in a country. During periods of sustained attack, there should be a shift towards security due to the monstrous violation of personal rights, which is the lot of the victims of terror and their families. But this should be regularly reviewed with an emphasis on guarding civil liberties and individual privacy wherever and whenever security considerations allow. Netanyahu also advised against tighter immigration laws as an essential tool to preemptive combat terrorism. However, critics saw that as a way to not let purified states or self-entitled purified states like Israel, and of course to the evangelical crowd inside the United States, which cater to the foreign visitors as well as the wish to immigrate inside the country. This is not shared by the Likud Party or the evangelical Christians. Netanyahu will go further. Quote, "This era of immigration, free for all, should be brought to an end. An important aspect of taking control of the immigration situation is stricter background checks of potential immigrants, coupled with the real possibility of deportation," end quote. He also cautioned that it is essential that governments do not conflate terrorists with those legitimate political groups that may or may not hold extremist views, but which advance their positions by means of debate and argument. However, the hypocritical nature of this statement regarding Netanyahu and his beliefs is that he designated political groups like Hezbollah a terrorist organization. The Israeli Peace Summit started in the year 2000 under President Bill Clinton, who convened a peace meeting between Palestinian President Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. The basis for the negotiations via the U.S. to the Palestinian president, a non-militarized Palestinian state split into 3 or 4 parts, containing most of the West Bank, parts of East Jerusalem, and the entire Gaza Strip. However, Arafat rejected the offer. And according to the Palestinian negotiations, the offer did not remove many of the elements of the Israeli occupation regarding land, security, settlements, and Jerusalem. No tenable solution was crafted which would satisfy both Israel or the Palestinian demands under Arafat. But things were only going to get worse. 2009, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton voiced support for the establishment of a Palestinian state, a solution not endorsed by the new Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the first Prime Minister to win twice. Upon the arrival of President Obama's administration Special Envoy, George Mitchell, a leading member of the Democratic Party, Netanyahu said that any furtherance of negotiations with the Palestinians would be conditioned on the Palestinians recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. However, Netanyahu's lies about the Palestinians, about Iraq, about Iran were quite repetitive.
There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking and is working and is advancing towards the development of nuclear weapons. No question whatsoever. And there is no question that once he acquires it, history shifts immediately. The dangers posed by a nuclear-armed Saddam were understood by my country 2 decades ago, well before September 11th. In 1981, the late Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, dispatched the Israeli Air Force on a pre-dawn raid that destroyed the Iraqi nuclear reactor at Osirak. This probably took place months away from Saddam's ability to assemble the critical mass of plutonium for the first atomic bomb, or more than one. And today, the United States must destroy the same regime because a nuclear-armed Saddam will place the security of our entire world at risk. And make no mistake about it, if and once Saddam has nuclear weapons, the terror network will have nuclear weapons. 2 decades ago, it was possible to thwart Saddam's nuclear ambitions by bombing a single installation. But today, nothing less than dismantling his regime will do, because Saddam's nuclear program has fundamentally changed in those 2 decades. He no longer needs one large reactor to produce the deadly material necessary for atomic bombs. He can produce it in centrifuges the size of washing machines that can be hidden throughout the country. And I want to remind you that Iraq is a very big country. It is not the size of Monte Carlo. It is a big country. And I believe that even free and unfettered inspections will not uncover these portable manufacturing sites of mass death.
And Iran is developing ballistic missiles to threaten the entire world. 2 years ago, I stood here and explained why the Iranian nuclear deal not only doesn't block Iran's path to the bomb, but actually paves it. Because the restrictions placed on Iran's nuclear program have what's called a sunset clause. Now, let me explain what that term means. It means that in a few years, those restrictions will be automatically removed, not by a change in Iran's behavior, not by a lessening of its terror or its aggression. They'll just be removed by a mere change in the calendar.
But that wasn't all. During President Obama's Cairo speech on June 4, 2009, in which Obama addressed the Muslim world, Obama stated, among other things, that the United States did not accept the legitimacy of continued Israeli settlements. Following Obama's Cairo speech, Netanyahu immediately called a special government meeting. And on June 14th, 10 days after Obama's Cairo speech, Netanyahu gave a speech at Bar Ilan University in which he endorsed a demilitarized Palestinian state, though said that Jerusalem must remain the unified capital of Israel. Netanyahu stated that he would accept the Palestinian state if Jerusalem were to remain the united capital of Israel. The Palestinians would have no army, and the Palestinians would give up their demand for the right of return He also argued the right for a habitual or natural growth in the existing Jewish settlements in the West Bank, while their permanent status is up to further negotiation. However, senior Palestinian official Shareb Erekat said that the speech had closed the door to permanent status negotiations due to Netanyahu's declarations on Jerusalem, refugees, and settlements. 3 months after starting his second term, Netanyahu remarked that his cabinet already had achieved several notable successes, such as the establishment of a working national unity government and a broad consensus for a two-state solution. In a report by Haaretz in July of 2009, found that most Israelis supported the Netanyahu government, giving him a personal approval rating of about 50%. Netanyahu had lifted checkpoints in the West Bank in order to allow freedom of movement and a flow of imports, a step that resulted in an economic boost in the West Bank. However, it was short-lived. In August of 2009, Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas declared that he would be willing to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu at the UN General Assembly, where Netanyahu had accepted President Obama's invitation for a triple summit, although he said it would not necessarily lead to negotiations. In March of 2010, Israeli governments approved construction of an additional 1,600 apartments in a large Jewish housing development in northeast Jerusalem called the Ramat Shlomo. This was going back on his word to the Palestinians that extra settlements would not be built. It wasn't the first time he went back on his word. Throughout the peace process and the Oslo Accords, as well as the Camp David Accords, in which he didn't agree with, he saw nothing beneficial in conceding extra land to the Palestinians, in which he helped to steal. But his views on Iran was exponentially becoming worse and worse every year. During many speeches he would give, he condemned Iran, saying that they were indeed the exporter or the largest exporter of jihadi terrorism in the world, even though behind closed doors, Netanyahu and the Israeli government were working on a coalition with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf.
Besides the money, it's also costing America a lot in terms of the perception it has in the Middle East. There is no better recruiting instrument for extremism against America than the relationship between the United States of America and Israel.
As an Egyptian, you can say that that's true definitely in Egypt.
Supporting regimes like the Saudi royal family and the Jordanian royal family and the Egyptian regime and others is actually creating quite a bit of extremism against America. And funny, if you look at the most famous names in the world of terrorism, besides, of course, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, you find Osama bin Laden, who came from Saudi Arabia, Ayman Zawahiri, who came from Egypt, and Zarqawi, who came from Jordan. The governments of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan are actually the most aligned with the United States in the whole world. Strange that the worst terrorists that want to harm America came from the countries where the governments are most aligned with the government of the United States of America. I think this is a very important point that people need to a hard look at.
Netanyahu's views on Iran became known on March 8, 2007. In an interview with CNN, Netanyahu claimed that there is only one difference between Nazi Germany and the Islamic Republic of Iran, namely that the first entered a worldwide conflict and then sought atomic weapons, while the latter is first seeking atomic weapons, and once it has them, will then start a world war. Netanyahu repeated these remarks at a news conference in April 2008. This was similar to early remarks that it's 1938 and Iran is Germany, and Iran is racing to arm itself with atomic weapons. By 2012, Netanyahu was reported to have formed a close confidential relationship with Defense Minister Ehud Barak, the prime minister during the Bush administration, as the two men considered possible Israeli military action against Iran's nuclear facilities following Israel's established Begin doctrine. The pair were accused of acting on Masonic impulses by Yuval Diskin, former head of the Shin Bet, who added that their warmongering rhetoric appealed to the idiots within the Israeli public. Diskin's remarks were supported by former Mossad chief Meir Dagan, who himself had previously said that an attack on Iran was the stupidest thing I have ever heard. A few weeks later, the Rand Corporation, a leading American think tank that advises the Pentagon, also openly disagreed with Netanyahu's belligerent stance, suggesting that in doing so, and without naming names, Rand sided with former Mossad chief Meir Dagan and former head of the Shin Bet, Yuval Diskin. 2 years later, Netanyahu used the opening ceremony for Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day to warn against the dangers of an Iranian nuclear bomb, saying he was following the example of Jewish leaders during World War II, who struggled to raise the alarm about the Nazis' genocidal intentions. Israeli academic Amir Cohen accused Netanyahu of showing contempt for the Holocaust by putting it to political use. But that didn't stop Netanyahu from lying about Iran. In fact, it extended even to Syria.
The United States would like to see Assad no longer the leader of Syria. They do not know who would they like to see replace him. They'd like to see negotiations. They would also like to include Iran and other neighbors in that process. Do you have any problem with that?
Yes, I do, because I think Iran has been the source of Assad's power. They're propping up Assad. They're making a power grab there. They're making a power grab in Yemen. They're arming all our enemies everywhere. They're in Iraq. They're in Afghanistan. They're not your friend. They're your enemy. Yes, you made a deal with them, a nuclear deal. We disagreed about that. And it was a disagreement, as President Obama and I both said, in the family. But we don't disagree.
Elliot Abrams said today.
But we don't disagree.
Elliot Abrams said today that Obama has a vendetta. That's what Elliot Abrams, a friend of Israel, said.
But does he speak for the president?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Does he reflect the belief of the Israeli prime minister?
President Obama called me at the height of the debate on the nuclear deal with Iran. And he said, I'd like to talk to you about bolstering Israel's security. We can do it while the debate is going on or after it's concluded. And I said, well, let's do it after it's concluded. This is the day after. This morning I met with Secretary of State John Kerry, and we started talking about bolstering Israel's security in the face of new realities. That deal has to be, the first thing on that deal is simple. We have to make sure that Iran abides by its obligations.
In the summer of 2012, CIA Director David Petraeus proposed a covert program of arming and training jihadist rebels. Initially, President Obama rejected the proposal, but later agreed, partly due to lobbying by foreign leaders like King Abdullah II of Jordan and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Timber Sycamore began in early 2013 and was similar to other Pentagon and CIA-run weapons routing and training programs that were established in previous decades to support foreign rebel forces, such as Operation Cyclone in 1979, in which the United States, through Pakistan ISI and Saudi donors, who armed and trained Mujahideen rebels against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Greg Miller and Adam Entwistle of the Washington Post stated that the operation had served as the centerpiece of the U.S. strategy to press Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to step aside. But that wasn't all. Israel tried to even corral members of the Iranian proxy forces and Lebanese Hezbollah into smaller cities to bomb them in aerial raids. This was just the beginning. In 2017, Israel began treating wounded Jabhat al-Nusra soldiers at Golan Heights hospitals. This was the beginning of who Israel was supporting, and it wasn't proxy forces. It was Wahhabi militants. So why were they doing this? What was the sense of treating terrorists, in which the United States enacted the war on terror in response to the September 11th, 2001 attacks? Was it previous foreign policy papers like the Oded Yanon Plan or the neoconservative Paul Wolfowitz Doctrine or the Project for New American Century? Why would they be doing this? It wouldn't matter. Netanyahu's indictments were handed down in 2019. He was officially indicted for breach of trust, accepting bribes, and fraud. And as a result of that indictment, Netanyahu was legally required to relinquish his ministry portfolios and his prime ministership. Numerous charges began in 2016 up until 2020. In case number 1000, which was officially opened in December 2016, Netanyahu was indicted for receiving valuable presents and gifts received by Netanyahu and his wife throughout the years from several wealthy acquaintances. In case number 2000, it dealt with recorded conversations Netanyahu had with Amon Moses, chairman and editor of Yedoth Alornoth, one of the largest newspapers in circulation in Israel, in which they discussed legislation that could harm Yedoth's major competitor, Israel Yahom. In case number 3000, which does not directly involve Netanyahu, but rather people with professional personal ties to Netanyahu in connection to a deal made between Israel and Germany for the purchase of 3 Dolphin-class submarines and 4 class corvette warships. In case number 4000 relates to telecommunications company Bezek's relationship with its regulator, the communication ministry at the time, headed by Netanyahu himself. Case number 1270 was an offshoot of case 4000 involving an alleged appointment bribe offer to an attorney general of Israel candidate in exchange for dropping a case against Netanyahu's wife. Several protests began between members of the Likud Party and those of the Labor Party. They were split, but Netanyahu had fallen out of favor. On December 19, 2018, Israeli State Prosecutor Shai Nizan recommended to Israeli Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit that Netanyahu should be indicted. And on February 28, 2019, the Supreme Court of Israel rejected a motion filed by Netanyahu's Likud Party to stall the publication of the Attorney General's recommendations. That same day, Mandelblit announced that he had accepted police recommendations to indict Netanyahu on 3 of the charges, that the indictment would officially go into effect without a hearing. As a result of the indictment, Netanyahu relinquished every position of government and tried to submit a request for immunity to the parliamentary speaker, Yedu Edelstein, on January 1st, 2020. On May 4th, 2021, Netanyahu's attorneys began cross-examining many people, including Ilan Yeshua. Yeshua stated, among other things, that Netanyahu got the website to remove stories about families of IDF soldiers who were killed in Gaza during the 2014 Gaza war. It was not clarified during cross-examination who it was who told the Walla editors to remove the stories about the bereaved families. Through Yeshua also claimed Netanyahu's wife, Sarah, would make requests to Walla editors as well. Ilan Yeshua is the CEO of Walla, which was a publishing company. The family of Hadar Golden, an IDF soldier, was killed in combat and whose remains have been held by Hamas since 2014, issued an angry response following Yeshua's testimony, stating that for years we have been yelling about the institutional silence directed from above when it came to returning my son. To what depths to the abyss can our leadership sink? Shame and disgrace. The corruption in Israel didn't end there, not with the trial of Benjamin Netanyahu, or the group of states against corruption, or the anti-Netanyahu protests, the International Anti-Corruption Academy, the group of states against corruption, the Transparency International, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and the ISO 37001 anti-bribery management systems, which saw Israeli governments under the Likud Party, under Ehud Barak, under Yitzhak Rabin, and many others, who demonized the Arab community, who destabilized Arab governments, and who destroyed any type of Arab hegemony in the region because of their failed leadership and their failed wish to have hegemony in a region they once had prior to the Zionists themselves. The question is, when does the United States start questioning the U.S. foreign policy involving Israel and why we have to suffer because of them?